So we're going to continue looking at finding missing sides in right triangles. Remember that you need a right triangle to use Pythagorean theorem or our trig ratios. So if you don't have a right triangle, you cannot use the trig ratios or Pythagorean theorem. So there's our three trig ratios. And we always start by labeling the sides of the triangle. The side across from the right angle is always the hypotenuse. That never changes. But the opposite and the adjacent will change. It depends what angle you're using or working from or trying to find. In this case here, that would be the angle theta. And the side across from the angle you're working with or using or trying to find is the opposite. And then the remaining side is labeled as the adjacent. So this is always our first step once we have our triangles. Label the sides. And then you figure out which ratio you're going to use depending on which two sides are going to be used in the equation. So, question says, find x or y in the following triangles, round to the nearest tenth. So we start by labeling the sides of the triangle. Side across from the right angle is the hypotenuse. Because you're given the 33-degree angle, you're going to use that. The side across from that is the opposite. Third side is the adjacent side. So in this case here, we're going to use the opposite and the adjacent. We're trying to find x, which is the opposite. We're given the 6.5, which is the adjacent. We're not given the hypotenuse, not trying to find it, not using it. We're using opposite and adjacent. And if we look at the ratios above, the tangent is the only one that uses opposite and adjacent. Yes, the sine uses opposite, but not the adjacent. Cosine uses adjacent, but not the opposite. Only tangent uses opposite and adjacent, and the order matters. The opposite is on top, the adjacent is on the bottom. And also remember our acronym SOHCAHTOA. There's something else that we can use to help us remember what those ratios are and what order the sides are in. The TOA part tells us that it's O first, A second. Opposite on top, adjacent on the bottom. But you will be given these ratios. I'll write them on the board for the quiz today, and as well when we have our exam after Christmas, you'll be given the ratios. You don't have to memorize them. But we've decided that we need to use the tan ratio here based on which two sides we are working with. And the tangent of the angle, which is 33 degrees, equals, whoops, just making sure that is 33, yeah, equals, and it's opposite first, adjacent second, opposite on top, adjacent on the bottom. So they must be in this order, must. And then what we've been doing is we've been making both sides a fraction and then cross multiplying. 1 times x equals 6.5 times the tangent of 33 degrees. We saw that sometimes when you cross multiply, you don't have the variable by itself, and there's an extra step that we need to do to get the variable by itself. But in this case, we have it by itself. So we just want to make sure that our calculator is in the degree mode, which I am. And now I can type in 6.5 times the tangent of 33 degrees. And if we round to the nearest tenth, it would be approximately 4.2, and that would be in feet. The same unit as the adjacent side. Okay? Question B. We want to find the length of y, which in this case is the hypotenuse. It's the side across from the right angle. That's what we're trying to find in this case. We're given the angle of 44 degrees. We're going to use that. The side across from that is the opposite. The third side is the adjacent. In this case here, we're trying to find y, which is the hypotenuse. We're given the 10.2, which is the adjacent side. We're going to use adjacent and hypotenuse, which is the cosine ratio. The cosine of 44 degrees equals, and again, the order matters. The ka part tells us that it's adjacent first, hypotenuse second. Adjacent on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. Must be in that order. Make both sides a fraction, so we can cross multiply. 1 times y, y times the cosine of 44 degrees equals 1 times 10.2. So this is one of those examples that when we cross multiply, we don't have the variable by itself. We need to do that one extra step, which in this case would be divide both sides by the cosine of 44 degrees. The cos of 44 is cancel, and now you have y by itself, and we can find out what it is by going 10.2 divided by the cosine of 44 degrees, which to the nearest tenth would be 14.2. And that would be in feet, the same unit as the adjacent side. This is our third day, I think, of using trig ratios to find missing sides of triangles. Everyone is done exactly the same way. We start by first labeling the sides of the triangle. So for question C, we want to find the value of x. The side across from the right angle is the hypotenuse. We're given the 28 degrees. We're going to use that. The side across from the angle you're working with, trying to find, is always the opposite. The third side is the adjacent side. In this case here, we're going to use the opposite and the hypotenuse. We're trying to find x, which is the opposite. We're given 31.5, which is the hypotenuse. Those are the two sides we're using. And SOHCAHTOA tells us that the sine ratio uses opposite and hypotenuse. The sine of 28 degrees, and the order matters. So tells us that it's O first, H second, opposite on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. Make both sides a fraction, and then cross multiply. 1 times x will equal 31.5 times the sine of 28 degrees. So that's what we're going to put in our calculator. So approximately 14.8. And that'll be in centimeters, the same unit as the hypotenuse. And we've talked before about the fact that you can always make sure your answer looks reasonable. We're trying to find x, which is the opposite. It has to be shorter than the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always the longest side. And it is. 14.8 is shorter than the hypotenuse. Also, the largest angle is across from the longest side. The shortest side is across from the smallest angle. So, the opposite is opposite 28-degree angle, which is quite small compared to the 90. So our answer should be quite small compared to the hypotenuse. And again, it is. Okay? Try D on your own, and then we'll check it. All right, so we're on lesson 5, Jackie. Side across from the right angle is the hypotenuse. You're given the angle of 46 degrees. You're going to use that. The side across from that is the opposite. Third side is the adjacent. In this case here, we're going to use the adjacent and the opposite. We're trying to find x, which is the adjacent. We're given the 10.45, which is the opposite. Those are the two sides we're using. And if you look above, the tan ratio uses those two sides. The tangent of the angle, which is 46 degrees, and again, the order matters. TOA tells it is opposite first, adjacent second. Opposite on top, adjacent on the bottom. Must be in that order. Make both sides a fraction, and then you're going to cross multiply. And when you do that, you're going to get x times the tangent of 46 degrees equals 1 times 10.45. And then to get x by itself, we would divide both sides by tan 46. And they cancel on the left, and now we have x by itself. We can find out what the approximate answer is by, again, going back to our calculator. 10.45 divided by the tan of 46 degrees. So round to the nearest tenth, it would be 10.1 centimeters. Same unit as the opposite side. Okay? So let's skip to F, where you want to find two missing sides. It doesn't matter which side we start with, okay? It doesn't. You can either find out what A is and then find B, or you can find B first and find A. So for no reason, let's just say we're going to find A first. The side across from the right angle is the hypotenuse. If we're going to use a 36-degree angle because we're given that, the side across from that is the opposite. The third side is the adjacent. I just decided that we're going to find A first. I could have found B first. Again, that doesn't matter. But I decided that I would find A first. So I'm going to use the opposite and the hypotenuse. And the SO part of SOHCAHTOA tells us that is the sine ratio. The sine of 36 degrees equals, and the SO part tells it it's O first, H second. Opposite on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. Make both sides a fraction, cross multiply. 1 times A equals 10 times the sine of 36 degrees. Which is 5.9. And there's no units on the hypotenuse, so there'll be no units on this side either. But there is the value of A. And now I need to find the value of B. And I have a couple options now. I can use a trig ratio again if I want, or I can also use Pythagorean theorem. When you have two sides of a right triangle, you can find the third side by using Pythagorean theorem, which we looked at on the first day of this chapter. A and B are the two legs of the right triangle. C is the hypotenuse. We were given the hypotenuse. We found A, the opposite, to be approximately 5.9. So using this formula, 5.9 squared plus B squared has to equal C, which is 10 squared. And the way we did these is we subtracted the 5.9 squared from both sides to get B squared by itself. because the 5.9 squareds will cancel on the left. And on the right, we'll have 10 squared. Take away that 5.9 squared, but we will not just type 5.9 in our calculator. We'll use the decimal that we found that's just above. In my calculator, it's the previous answer that I can get. If you don't have that function on your calculator, you need to type in 5.877852523 and then square it. The more decimals you use, the more accurate your answer will be. Sometimes it'll make a difference when you're rounding to the nearest tenth. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, b squared is 65.5. And again, we're rounding that number to write it down, but we're keeping the number in our calculator. We're going to take the square root of the entire number, the previous answer, which gives us approximately 8.1 when we take the square root of both sides. Both of those answers that we got for A and B are reasonable because they have to be shorter than the hypotenuse. And they are. Now again, if we didn't keep the entire 5.8778, etc. in our calculator, let's see if it'll make a difference. If we just went 10 squared minus 5.9 squared, it gives us that number, and when we take the square root of that, in this case, it actually doesn't make a difference. If you compare it to what we got above here, it is different though, because this was 8.09016994. This one is different, 8.07. So if you were rounding these answers to the nearest hundredth, 2 decimal places, it would make a difference in the answer. To the nearest tenth, in this case, it doesn't, but sometimes it will. We always keep these numbers in our calculators. Only round off the final answer. Okay, so if we skip down to H, then we want to find X and Y. We start by labeling the sides of the triangle, the side across from the right angle, which would be that angle down there is the hypotenuse. In this case here, we're going to use a 30-degree angle. The side across from that is the opposite. Third side is the adjacent. So now we just have to decide if we're going to find X or Y first. It doesn't matter. Let's say we're going to find Y first. So you're going to use the 5, which is the opposite. You want to find Y, which is the adjacent. Opposite and adjacent is the tan ratio. The tan of 30 degrees equals, and again, the order matters. The total part tells us that it's opposite on top, adjacent on the bottom. So that's what it must look like. Make both sides a fraction, cross multiply, you'll get y times the tan of 30 degrees equals 1 times 5. And then we'll divide both sides by tan 30. The tan 30's cancel. You have y by itself. And we'll find out what it equals by going 5 divided by the tangent of 30 degrees, which to the nearest tenth would be 8.7. And there's no units on the opposite side, so no units on this either. So now we want to find the value of x, which is the hypotenuse. So again, we can use a trig ratio again if we want, or we can use Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. A and b are the 2 legs of the triangle. We were given one leg to be 5. We found the second leg to be approximately 8.7. We're going to find out what c is. So I got 5 squared plus, and again, I'm going to use the entire decimal in my calculator. 5 squared plus that value squared is exactly 100. And so when you take the square root of both sides, c is going to equal 10. Okay? So if you just use the 8.7, 5 squared plus 8.7 squared, you definitely won't get exactly 100. When you take the square root, and rounded it, you would get 10. But sometimes it will make a difference, as I've said over and over again. Okay? Now, also in this case, if you look, it looks like maybe they want us to find angle B up here as well. Okay? Which is easy to do because we've got two angles of the right triangle. Remember, the three angles of every triangle always add up to 180 degrees. We already got a 90-degree angle here, so which means the other two must add up to 90 as well to give us a total of 180. B can be found by going 90 minus the other angle of 30, which is 60 degrees. So essentially what we did here is we solved this right triangle. We found all missing sides and all missing angles. That's what it means to solve a triangle. Find all missing sides, all missing angles. Okay? So we're done this lesson. I will hand out the quiz for you guys to do.